There is a particular quality of silence inside the clarification chamber of the hegemon throne that you do not encounter anywhere else in the 11 species compact. It is not the silence of attention. It is not the silence of waiting. It is the silence of a room that has already decided and is performing the formality of deciding. I had been inside that chamber 4 times before the morning I am describing to you now. Once as an aide carrying documents for the senior attaché during the Lenthari boundary revision, 6 years ago. A session that lasted 4 hours and resolved in the way that sessions in that chamber nearly always resolve, which is to say quietly and in the throne's favor. Once as a junior analyst observing the ratification of the 3rd auxiliary tariff, 4 years ago, a genuinely minor correction that I had attended specifically to study how the chamber's procedural rhythm worked when it was not under pressure. Twice in my current role, embedded records analyst for the human diplomatic mission, cleared to sit in the observer gallery above the main floor, forbidden to speak, permitted to transcribe. 4 times before that morning. I had learned the silence well enough to read the quality of it from across the room. That morning the silence was the 3rd kind, the kind that had already decided. The chamber itself was old, by the standards of the compact, older than the Concord of Verath, which was the document they were there to amend. The walls were dressed in pale gray stone shot through with amber veins, a material quarried from the throne's home system that did not exist anywhere else in the 11 species compact, and that had been chosen for precisely that reason. The message was not subtle, once you knew to look for it. This chamber was built from material that only we possess, and everything that happens within it happens on our terms. The seating tiers wrapped in a shallow curve around the primary floor, 11 rows of them, each row slightly higher than the one below, so that every delegate looked down on the floor. The floor itself held only one seat, the archivist's chair, at the center of a long horizontal table. The archivist presented. Everyone else sat in the tiers and evaluated. The implicit message of the geometry was the same as the implicit message of the stone walls. This is a room structured so that one authority speaks and everyone else receives. The geometry was deliberate. It had been deliberate for 400 years. Above the main floor, recessed into the vaulted ceiling, a series of holographic display panels carried the session's formal record in real time, the agenda, the attending delegations, the procedural status. They were the only technology in the chamber that was visible from all angles. Everything else, the communication systems, the document readers, the pneumatic dispatch infrastructure, was built into the furniture and the walls, invisible until needed, so that the chamber's dominant impression was of stone and ceremony rather than mechanism. This, too, was deliberate. The clarification chamber was designed to look like a room in which decisions were permanent. I sat in the observer gallery at the top of the chamber, behind a curved brass railing worn smooth by the hands of several generations of junior staffers who had gripped it in moments of professional anxiety. The gallery ran along the entire back wall of the upper tier. There were perhaps 60 people in it that morning, transcriptionists, junior aides, 3 journalists who had been credentialed by the throne's press office, a handful of researchers from the university affiliates of 3 member species. We were separated from the delegate tiers by a waist-high glass partition that was more symbolic than structural. We were observers. We were not actors. My official designation that morning was 4th-tier records analyst, human diplomatic mission to the hegemon compact. It was an accurate designation as far as it went. What it did not say, because those kinds of designations never say it, was that I had been in intelligence work for 9 years before my posting to the human mission's diplomatic corps. That I had spent 3 of those years specifically studying the throne's archival infrastructure, not as an academic interest, but as a professional one. That my clearance level inside the mission was 4 tiers above what my official title implied. That I had been in this gallery 4 times before, not merely to observe but to read. to watch the throne's procedural mechanisms at work, and to understand exactly how they operated when they believed no one was watching carefully. The work I had done before this posting was not glamorous work. It never is, in my experience, whatever people imagine when they imagine intelligence operations. The work is almost entirely reading. You read the documents that are available to everyone, and you read them more carefully than anyone else reads them, looking for the shape of what is not said. You read the procedural history of the body you are watching, going back further than anyone expects, because the mechanisms that matter tend to be old ones, put in place when someone needed them and forgotten about when they stopped needing them immediately. You track the patterns of how decisions are made, not what is decided, but when, and in what sequence and by whom, and what the timing tells you about the decision that has not been announced yet. I had spent 18 months before that session, reading the Throne's Clarification Office's procedural history. 18 months of cross-referencing correction filings against compact archive records, against the audit schedule, against the current tier standings of all 11 member species. It was not exciting work. It was the kind of work that produces, at the end of it, a very clear picture of what a body intends to do that it has not said it intends to do. The picture I had produced, 14 months in, was the analysis I had brought to Ambassador Vasson on the afternoon the correction language was circulated. The analysis had not surprised her, because she had been building toward a parallel understanding from the political side, through channels I did not have access to and did not need. What surprised her, what I could see in the brief controlled expression she allowed herself when she set the case file on the desk beside my analysis, was how completely our two pictures aligned. The Compact's intelligence services are not discussed openly. This is true of all 11 species. It is a polite collective fiction that the delegates in the tiers below operate in an environment of pure legal and diplomatic principle, untouched by the messier work of understanding who knows what, when, and what they intend to do with it. The fiction holds well enough for day-to-day compact operations. In sessions like the one I am describing, the fiction becomes very thin indeed. The Throne's political liaison in the observer box was not there for the view. The Surath Collective's third chair delegate, who had been seated that morning with an unusual posture of forward attention that I had noted when I came in, was not there simply because the Surath Collective cares deeply about archival housekeeping. The Lenthari observer team, 3 of whom had clearances that their academic credentials did not explain, were not there because they found the clarification chamber's ratification procedures intellectually stimulating. Everyone in that room who mattered was there because they knew, or suspected, or had prepared for, the possibility that this session was not what its agenda said it was. The difference was that some of them knew it from the Throne's side of the preparation, and we knew it from ours. Below me, in the delegate tiers, the morning session was arranging itself. The 11 member species of the Compact each maintain a delegation of between 4 and 12 seats, depending on their standing tier. Humanity held 8 seats in the third tier, as we had held 8 seats since our provisional admission to the Compact 19 years earlier. Provisional. That word was still in our official designation. Provisional member, pending full ratification review, which the Throne's Clarification Office had been delaying on procedural grounds for 11 of those 19 years. I knew the exact number. It was part of my job to know it. Our delegation that morning was led by Ambassador Nora Vasson. She was 54 years old, a former senior negotiator from a civilian arbitration background, gray-haired, compact in build, with the kind of stillness that reads in a room as either indifference or total attention. In my experience of her, it was always the second. She had been at the mission for 8 years. Before that, she had spent 12 years working trade dispute resolution for a multi-system commercial consortium, which had given her a very specific set of skills. The ability to read a document for what it was designed to obscure rather than what it said, and the patience to sit in a room for a long time without giving anything away. She sat in the center of our 8 seats with her hands flat on the small writing surface in front of her. She had a glass of water to her left. She had a single case file in front of her. The case file was closed. To her right sat Deputy Envoy Combe Heron, 41, who had been with the mission for 6 years, and who carried himself with the particular economy of motion of someone who had learned to waste nothing, not a gesture, not a syllable. To her left sat Trade Liaison Raya Osterlind, who was the most senior member of the mission after Vassan, and who held the human delegation's authority over commercial provisions in the compact. The other 5 seats held analysts and legal staff. I knew all of them. I knew all of their functions. I also knew that all of them, including the legal staff at the far end of the row, had been briefed on what was in Vassan's case file. What I knew that none of the other observers in the gallery knew. What I knew that, I suspected, most of the delegates in the tiers below had not even begun to consider, was what the case file contained, and more importantly, how long it had been prepared. I had helped prepare it. The session was called to order at the 9th bell of the throne's morning cycle, which corresponds to roughly 8:30 by the human reckoning I still think in. The presiding arbiter was a Kelthani elder named Savrathren, who had held the post for 12 years, and who was regarded by everyone in the compact's political circles as a reliable instrument of the throne's preferences, without being the kind of reliable instrument that attracts scrutiny. He was skilled at that balance. He called the room to attention with 2 slow strikes of the brass bell at his lectern, and the ambient murmur of the chamber subsided. The morning's agenda had been circulated 3 days prior. It listed the session's purpose as ratification of administrative correction to the Concord of Varath, reference amendment 7 Theta 9, corrective historical entry revision, compact archive series 1 through 44. Administrative correction. That was the language they had chosen. In the 47 years since the Concord of Varath had been signed, that foundational document, the Treaty of Mutual Recognition and binding legal compact that all 11 member species had ratified as the basis of their shared governance framework. There had been, according to the Throne's Clarification Office, 17 administrative corrections. Most of them were genuinely minor, a species designation updated when a political reorganization changed a member's formal name, a border notation revised when a surveying error was corrected, a trade provision clarified with supplementary language after a decade of ambiguous interpretation. 17 corrections. I had read all of them. I had read them not out of archival diligence alone, but because I had been looking for 2 years at the pattern of what the Throne's Clarification Office chose to correct and how it chose to frame the corrections. The pattern was informative. Most of the 17 corrections were genuinely administrative. 2 of them were not, but were small enough and sufficiently tangential to core attribution that they had not drawn objection. They had established a precedent, though. They had established the procedural model for what 7 Theta 9 was attempting to do on a much larger scale. The 18th correction was not minor. The Concord of Varath had a preamble. Most legal compacts do, and most of them are ignored after the signing. This one had not been ignored because its preamble contained the founding attribution, the formal acknowledgement of which species had proposed the framework of the compact, which had drafted the initial binding language, and which had underwritten the first 7 years of its operational costs. Attribution matters in interstellar political bodies. It determines precedence in certain procedural votes. It determines the weighting of the foundational audit, which occurs every 25 years and which can, in theory, result in the restructuring of member-tier standings. Attribution is not merely historical sentiment. It is a structural mechanism with real present-day consequences. The next foundational audit was scheduled in 3 years. The original Concord of Varath attributed the framework's proposal to 3 species jointly: the Kelthani, the Surath Collective, and humanity. Humanity, a species that, at the time of the Concord's drafting, had been in compact contact for only 11 years, had contributed 2 negotiators to the original drafting commission, and had underwritten, through a combination of resource grants and logistical infrastructure, approximately 40% of the Concord's initial operational overhead. 40%, I knew that number too. Administrative correction, 7 Theta 9, proposed to revise the founding attribution. It removed humanity from the list of co-proposing species and replaced the reference with a notation attributing our contribution to auxiliary technical support provided by provisional member humanity. Not co-proposing, not co-drafting, not foundational, auxiliary technical support. The language had been chosen very carefully. Auxiliary technical support carries no structural weight in the foundational audit mechanism. A co-proposing species has procedural review rights that an auxiliary contributor does not. 3 years before the next foundational audit. I had read the correction language 6 times when it was first circulated, 4 days before the session. I had read it with the specific quality of attention I had been trained to apply to documents that are designed to appear unremarkable while achieving something that is not. I had mapped it against the previous 17 corrections. I had mapped it against the upcoming audit schedule. I had cross-referenced it against the current membership tier standings and the procedural rules governing audit-weighted reviews. By the time I was finished, I had a very clear picture of what it would accomplish, and for whom, and why the timing had been chosen, and how long the preparation for it had taken. I had brought my analysis to Ambassador Vasson on the afternoon the correction language was circulated. I had walked it through with her in the detail it required. She had read my analysis and the correction language side by side, and she had been quiet for a moment in the way that she is quiet when she is not deciding something but confirming something she has already decided. Then she had said, "Good, that confirms what we prepared for." She had reached into her desk drawer and produced the closed case file and set it beside the correction language on her desk. I had asked how long it had been prepared. She had said, "The distribution manifest has been current for 2 years. The original archival work goes back 60. I had looked at the case file for a moment. Then I had asked what she needed from me for the session. She had said she needed me in the gallery, with a clear view of the main floor, and that I should time everything from the moment the chip was received. She said that was the only task, timing and observation. She said the rest was already done. That was the last time I had felt anything other than a cold professional calm about the morning I am describing. The throne's chief archivist, a Vethsalani named Kareth Dehine, whose species tend to thin, blue-gray limbs and deep-set amber eyes that give them an expression of permanent mild disapproval, rose from the archivist's chair on the main floor and began her presentation. The Vethsalani are precise speakers. They do not embellish and they do not minimize. They give you the exact formulation and expect you to understand it. Kareth Dehine presented the correction in exactly the terms the circulated agenda had used: administrative housekeeping, historical accuracy review, correction of a documentation error in the original Concord's preamble. She presented a comparative table showing the original language and the proposed revised language. She referenced 3 procedural precedents from earlier corrections. She noted that the correction had been reviewed by the throne's legal office and found to be within the scope of the clarification chamber's ratification authority. She presented it with the flat professional authority of someone who had done this 17 times before for genuinely minor corrections, and had every reason to expect the 18th to proceed on the same terms. She did not explain why the documentation error had gone unnoticed for 47 years. She was not asked. The standard procedure for a ratification session requires each member delegation to have the opportunity to register an objection before the presiding arbiter calls the ratification vote. Objections must be submitted in writing to the archivist's table. The presiding arbiter then reads each objection aloud. The archivist responds formally, and the arbiter determines whether the objection triggers a full deliberation period or whether it can be resolved procedurally. In the 11 previous ratification sessions I had observed or reviewed in the mission's records, no delegation had submitted a written objection. The procedure existed on paper. It had not been tested in practice. There was a reason for this, and it was not that no one had ever had reason to object. It was that submitting a written objection in a clarification chamber session carries a cost. It positions the objecting delegation in formal opposition to the throne's administrative record, which carries political consequences that most delegations calculate are not worth the benefit of delaying a correction they cannot ultimately stop anyway. The throne's record management authority over compact archives was, by the compact's own procedural rules, nearly absolute. Nearly. I watched Ambassador Vasson. She sat with her hands flat on the writing surface. She did not write. She did not move. Kareth Dehine concluded her presentation, returned to her chair, and looked toward the presiding arbiter. Savrathren looked across the delegate tiers. He asked, in the standard formula, whether any delegation wished to register a written objection before the ratification vote was called. He asked it with the tone of a question that expected no answer, the tone that had received no answer 11 times before. Vasson did not raise her hand. She did not stand. She reached forward, picked up the single data chip that was sitting on top of her closed case file, and placed it on the narrow pneumatic dispatch tray at the front edge of her writing surface. The dispatch tray is a mechanical system built into each delegate station, a legacy of an earlier era when physical documents were the primary medium for session correspondence. It carries items directly to the archivist's table on the main floor via a system of pressurized tubes concealed in the chamber walls. Most delegates in the current era never use it. Some of the junior aides in the current delegations had probably never seen it activated. The small tray extended, accepted the chip, and retracted. There was a faint mechanical sound, barely audible from the gallery, a soft pneumatic click, and then the hiss of the tube taking up the delivery. A light on the archivist's table indicated a document had been received. Vasson's hands returned to the writing surface, flat, as they had been. Kareth Dehine looked down at the chip on the delivery tray. She looked up at the presiding arbiter. Savrathren looked at the chip tray, then at the human delegation, then at Kareth Dehine, then at the chip tray again, in a sequence of small adjustments that told me he had not expected this and was not certain how to proceed. His voice, when he spoke, was composed but slightly slower than it had been. He said that a written communication had been received from the human delegation. He asked the archivist to review and read it into the record. Kareth Dehine inserted the chip into the reader at her table. I started timing. She looked at it for a long moment. The amber eyes did not shift from the display. The expression, which had been one of bureaucratic neutrality throughout her presentation, did not change in any dramatic way. But there was something, a stillness, a quality of holding very carefully, that is readable in Vetselani even for someone who has spent less time watching them than I had. It is not a subtle tell when you know it. The slight compression around the eye sockets, the way the hands, visible on the table's surface, stop their ambient movement and become too still. She looked at the presiding arbiter. She said, in a voice that was precisely calibrated to carry no further than the main floor table and the first 2 tiers of seating, "Presiding arbiter, I need a moment." Savrathren called a brief procedural recess. 1 minute 40 seconds had passed since the chip was delivered. I wrote down the time. In the gallery above, the journalist's transcription devices stopped. The researchers looked up from their notes. One of the Kelthani junior aides 2 seats to my left half rose from his chair, looked down at the main floor, and sat back down. The murmur that fills a room when a session pauses for an unscheduled reason began to build. the low comparative noise of people who don't know what has happened but can feel that something has. I gripped the brass railing and kept my eyes on the main floor. 3 of Kareth D. Hines' senior archive staff came down from the archivist's administrative box, which sits just above the main floor to the right of the archivist's table, and gathered around her reader. They read the chip in sequence. I watched their faces. The first one, a younger Vethsalani whose name I did not know, read it and looked up at Kareth D. Hines with the expression that means, in their species, a sharp, rapid reassessment of a situation. The second read it more slowly and then stood with his hands behind his back. The third read it and immediately turned to the fourth staff member, said something very quietly, and that staff member walked at a controlled, rapid pace up through the delegate tiers toward the main chamber entrance. I followed the walking staff member with my eyes. He went to the observer-adjacent box to the right of the chamber's main entrance, a box reserved for high-ranking observers who were not technically delegates, a position that serves no one when what they want is deniability. The throne's senior political liaison was seated there. Her name was Venarath. I had a file on her. She was the most senior throne political officer in the chamber who was not on record as a session participant. The staff member leaned down and spoke quietly to her for approximately 20 seconds. I watched Venarath's face during those 20 seconds. She is Vethsalani as well. The amber eyes did not move. Then the staff member finished and straightened and went back to the main floor, and Venarath sat for a moment and then reached for her personal communicator. Her hand stopped partway through the motion. They hung without purpose for 3 full seconds. Then she completed the reach and brought the communicator up. I made a note of the time. 4 minutes, 22 seconds into the recess. What the chip contained, what Kareth D. Hines and her staff were now reading, and what Venarath was now apparently explaining to someone on the other end of her communicator, was the following. 60 years before the Concord of Varath was signed, the 2 human negotiators who would eventually co-draft the compact's foundational language, Envoy Maris Kale and her deputy, a legal architect named Torin Bish, had built into the Concord's drafting process something that was not required by the compact's own procedural rules, and that no other species negotiating team had thought to include. They had created a distributed archive. Every draft of every version of the Concord of Varath's preamble, from the initial working document through the 14 revision cycles to the final signed text, had been simultaneously filed in multiple independent repositories. The Concord's own archive, the Human Missions Archive, and this was the part that the Throne's legal office had apparently not thought to check, 41 independent species-neutral archives, maintained by member species, affiliated academic institutions, and 3 non-member observer bodies that had been invited to witness the signing. The distribution had been automatic. It had been part of the filing protocol Kale and Bish had written into the document management system during the drafting process, with the consent of the Concord's other co-drafters, on the stated grounds that important foundational documents should exist in redundant form across all participating bodies. Every version, every revision, every notation automatically filed, simultaneously, across 43 separate repositories at the moment of each version's completion. None of those 41 external repositories were under the Throne's Clarification Office's authority. The Concord's own archive was. The Human Missions Archive was, technically, subject to human internal authority only. The other 41 were not the Throne's to touch. They had never been the Throne's to touch. And they had been holding, for 60 years, in standard long-term archival cold storage, the unredacted original Concord of Varath with its founding attribution intact. The data chip ambassador Vassan had sent to the archivist's table contained a complete distribution manifest, 43 repository names, 43 filing dates, 43 confirmation receipts. Every external repository confirmed current holding status as of 3 weeks prior. verified by the mission's archival staff through standard interinstitutional inquiry protocols that raise no flags because archival verification inquiries are routine compact administration. The manifest also contained something that Vasson's legal team had prepared specifically for this session. It contained a comparative analysis showing the procedural consequence of what the throne's correction had created. Administrative Correction 7 Theta 9 now existed in the official compact archive as a document formally proposing to alter an historical record for which 42 other copies, unchanged, verified, time-stamped to 60 years ago, existed across the compact. If the correction were ratified, the compact's official archive would carry a document whose entire purpose was to alter a record that remained unaltered in 42 other locations, each of which was a recognized compact or affiliated institution. The ratified correction would not change the Concord of Verath. It would be the only document in the compact's history that explicitly contradicted 42 simultaneous copies of the original. It would be the most comprehensively documented falsification attempt in 400 years of compact history. The analysis made that sequence explicit in the flat procedural language of compact legal review with citations. The recess lasted 11 minutes in total. I timed every segment of it. By the time Sovrathren reconvened the session, the throne's political liaison had made 3 communicator calls. 2 of Kareth Dehine's senior staff had been in visible quiet conference at the archivist's table, and 3 delegation heads in the first tier had been approached by their own liaisons with whispered summaries, the Lenthari, the Dravathi, and the Surath Collective. Of the 3, the Surath Collective's reaction was the most contained, and for that reason the most telling. They had been, in the original attribution, one of the 2 species listed alongside humanity as co-proposers. The correction had elevated them to a position of structural majority in the upcoming audit review, eliminating humanity's foundational standing. They had not objected to the correction when it was circulated. They had not filed any communication with the clarification office. They had, I strongly suspected, known roughly what the human delegation was holding, or at least that the human delegation was likely holding something, and they had been waiting to see whether it would be produced before they decided how to respond. When the chip was delivered, they knew. The Surath Collective delegation head turned to look at the human delegation in a way that was not hostile and was not warm. It was the look of someone recalibrating a set of estimates. I noted it. When the recess ended and Sovrathren reconvened the session, the quality of the silence in the chamber had changed completely. It was no longer the silence of a room that had already decided. It was the silence of a room that was working very hard to appear as though it had not just been in 11 minutes of rapid private recalibration. The presiding arbiter announced, in language that was slightly less fluid than his opening, that the human delegation's communication had been received and was being formally entered into the session record. He said that the archivist would respond to the contents at the appropriate procedural moment. He asked Kareth Dehine to proceed. Kareth Dehine stood from the archivist's chair and faced the delegate tiers. She had composed herself in the 11 minutes of the recess. I will give her that. Her voice was level. Her posture was upright. Only someone who had been watching Vethsalani faces for as long as I had would have caught the slight compression around the amber eyes, the controlled flatness that indicates a speaker who is choosing each word from a prepared set rather than speaking naturally. She said, "The human delegation has submitted a distribution manifest for the original drafting archive of the Concord of Verath, indicating concurrent filing across 43 repositories at the time of the Concord's original execution. The archivist's office is not in a position at this session to contest the validity of those filings. The manifest has been accepted into the session record." A pause, very brief. The archivist's office notes that Administrative Correction 7 Theta 9 has not yet been ratified and remains subject to the Chamber's deliberative authority. Another pause. The Archivist's Office recommends that the presiding arbiter consider referring this session's agenda to the Procedural Review Committee before the ratification vote is called. That was everything. She sat down. In the tiers, the noise began. It did not begin all at once. It began in the way that noise in a body of that size and that diplomatic training always begins, with the nearest delegates turning to one another, and then the radius of conversation expanding outward. The Kelthani delegation, who had been the throne's primary allied bloc in the corrections preparation, turned inward in a cluster of muted but visible agitation. The Surath collective, who had been the other two named co-proposers in the original attribution, and who I noticed were very carefully not looking toward the Kelthani or toward the human delegation simultaneously. They were looking at the session record display, reading the manifest language as it was entered, in the posture of species who are evaluating their next move. The Lenthari observer tier, who had no procedural stake in the matter but who were the compact's most reliable information carriers, and were already, I was certain, composing their own analyses. The Dravathi bloc, who held 5 seats in the second tier and whose political positioning over the past 11 years had been closely aligned with the throne's preferences, and who were now, I noticed, positioned at a slight physical remove from their own delegation heads, in the way that political animals in any species instinctively create distance between themselves and a position that has just been exposed. I did not look at Ambassador Vassin. I did not need to. I could see her from the corner of my eye, and I knew she had not moved. She was still sitting with her hands flat on the writing surface. Her glass of water was where it had been at the start of the session. The closed case file was where it had been, minus the data chip. She had not turned toward her deputy or her liaison. She had not leaned back. She was looking at the main floor with the expression I had come to think of as her working face. Neutral, slightly elevated chin, eyes at middle focus, not aimed at anything specific, and therefore taking in everything. Heron, to her right, was making notes. Osterlin, to her left, was looking at her own display. The legal staff at the end of the row were in a quiet conference. The human delegation as a whole presented, from the gallery above, the profile of a team that had expected this session and had already moved to the work that came after it. Savrathren did not call an immediate vote. He could not. The objection was formally in the record. The motion to refer to procedural review was formally in the record. To call the ratification vote now would be to ratify a correction while an objection was pending, a procedural error that would itself be subject to challenge in the compact's review mechanisms, and that would invite exactly the kind of external scrutiny the throne's office was least equipped to survive at this particular moment. He called a full deliberative recess and asked the delegation heads to submit their positions in writing by the 3rd bell of the afternoon cycle. That was the moment, I think, when the chamber understood that the ratification was not going to happen, not today, and given what was now in the session record, probably not ever. I know what the throne's political liaison said when she reached the senior political officer waiting in the corridor outside the chamber. I know because I spoke to a member of her support staff 2 days later, in the course of routine intelligence work that did not require me to explain my interest. She had walked out of the observer box and directly to the corridor door, and when the door closed behind her she had said, to the 2 staffers and the senior officer waiting there, in a voice that was not calibrated for the corridor's acoustics, "The original is in 43 archives. It has been in 43 archives for 60 years. They were waiting for us to do this." The senior officer had apparently said nothing for a moment. Then he had said, "Which 43? She had said, "All of them." I am told there was a silence after that. I can imagine the quality of it. It would have been the 4th kind, The kind that comes after a decision made a long time ago has finally, fully landed. What followed over the subsequent weeks was, in the formal record of the compact, described as a period of administrative clarification. It is a testament to the throne's bureaucratic capacities that they managed to cast what had happened as a clarification rather than what it was. Correction 7 Theta 9 was formally withdrawn from the ratification docket on the grounds of incomplete archival review. The clarification chamber issued a notice stating that all pending administrative corrections to the Concord of Verath would be subject to a comprehensive cross-repository verification process before any future ratification session. This process, the notice indicated, was expected to require between 18 months and 3 years. The Concord of Verath's original preamble remained unchanged in the official compact archive. Humanity remained listed as co-proposing and co-drafting species. The founding attribution remained intact. I spent the 3 days immediately after the session writing an analysis of what had happened for the mission's classified record. It took 3 days because I wanted it to be complete, not a summary of the events in the chamber, which the session's official transcript would capture, but an analysis of the preparation that had preceded them, the decision points at which the throne's office had committed itself to the correction without first verifying the distribution record, the intelligence gaps that had made the commitment possible, and the lessons for the mission's future work. Ambassador Vasson had asked me for that analysis. She had asked for it before the session, which told me she had been planning for the need for it before the outcome was confirmed. That was the quality of mind I had come to expect from her. The analysis was 31 pages. She read it in 2 hours and sent back a single-line response. Archive it in triplicate. It was a small joke and also completely serious. I archived it in triplicate. 3 weeks after the session, the Compact's Foundational Audit Committee, a body that convenes independently of the throne and whose membership rotates across all 11 species, announced that it would be conducting an early audit, 2 years ahead of the standard cycle, to review the accuracy of all archive materials related to founding attribution and procedural precedent. The announcement did not name the clarification chamber's withdrawn correction. It did not name the human delegation's submitted manifest. It did not need to. The sequence of events was its own statement. The audit committee was chaired by a Surath Collective representative. The Surath Collective had been, in the original attribution, the third co-proposing species. They had said nothing during the session in which their co-attribution would also have been diminished. The correction had listed them and the Kelthani as the sole co-proposers, a revision that would have given the throne's closest allied species a structural majority in the upcoming audit mechanism, while appearing to elevate the Surath Collective's standing. They had said nothing because they had needed to see what the human delegation would produce before they decided where to stand. When we produced it, they moved within 2 weeks. The audit committee took 14 months to complete its review. I was no longer at the mission when it concluded, having been rotated to a different posting, but I followed the findings through the mission's intelligence summaries. The committee found, among other things, that the original Concord's language granting co-proposing species certain review rights over provisional membership determinations had been applied selectively over the preceding 19 years in ways that were inconsistent with the text. The finding did not name any party. The procedural consequences were automatic. Full membership, no longer provisional, 19 years after admission, 14 months after a data chip slid across a pneumatic dispatch tray. I have thought about Mari's Kale often since that session. She died 23 years before I was born. I have read everything available about her, the institutional records, the sparse biographical material, the one extended interview she gave to a compact history commission in the last year of her life. In that interview, she was asked what she had considered the most important technical decision of the Concord drafting process. She had said, without apparent drama, distribution. You write a document that matters and you make sure it exists in more places than anyone can control. Everything else is commentary. She had been 29 years old when she wrote that filing protocol into the document management system. 29 years old, 11 years into humanity's first contact with the Compact's predecessor body, working from a mission office on a station we had been assigned as observers rather than participants. She had written it in because it was good practice, she said in the interview, because important documents should exist in redundant forms, because that was how you protected work that mattered. She did not say, because someday, 60 years from now, someone with authority over one of those archives will try to quietly erase us. She did not say that. It is possible she did not think it in those terms. The interview was conducted by a historian who asked politely probing questions about her diplomatic philosophy, and she gave politely complete answers that revealed nothing she did not choose to reveal. She had spent her career in environments where the distinction between what you say and what you mean is not a rhetorical nicety but a survival skill. By the time the historian sat across from her, she was 71 years old and had been doing that calculation automatically for 50 years. But she built for it anyway. Whatever she thought she was building for, redundancy, professional best practice, institutional memory, simple good archival hygiene, what she actually built was a 60-year guarantee. A guarantee that the record of what humanity had contributed would exist in more repositories than any single authority in the Compact could ever touch. She had not needed to say, "I am doing this so that our erasure will be impossible." The action said it. The action said it more permanently than any declaration she could have made in that chamber. I have thought about that particular quality of action many times. The action that speaks without speaking, because it has already been completed before the conversation that might require speech ever begins. It is the deepest form of the niche's signature, not the walkout, not the single flat sentence, not even the chip on the dispatch tray. It is the preparation that makes all of those gestures possible, the work done years before anyone thought to look, the record filed in 43 places while the institution was still assuming it controlled the only copy. The silence in the chamber that morning was not ours. We had never needed to be loud. We had needed to be thorough. Cale was thorough. It is a quality I have tried to carry with me through 9 years of work that rewards it more than it rewards anything else. I spent a great deal of time in the months after that session, thinking about what it means to prepare for something you may not consciously anticipate. It is a particular quality of mind, not paranoia, which is reactive and tends to overspecify its fears, but something more like structural seriousness about the permanence of records and the transience of institutions. Cale understood at 29 that the institution she was working with was not the same thing as the document she was writing. The institution would change, would drift, would serve other interests over time. The document, if it was distributed widely enough, would not change. Documents are more trustworthy than institutions. Wide distribution is more trustworthy than central custody. These are not observations that require a career in intelligence to arrive at, but a career in intelligence tends to make them feel less abstract. I had gone into intelligence work because I found that principle interesting in the abstract. I stayed in it because it turned out to be the principle everything else ran on. The provisional designation was lifted from humanity's Compact membership status 14 months after the session. I received a brief message from Ambassador Vasson when the ratification was confirmed. It said, Cale was right about distribution. She was also right that everything else is commentary. There was nothing else. It was the kind of message I had expected from her, which is to say it was exactly the right length. I have kept it. There are people who will tell you that the story of that session is a story about strategic foresight, about the value of institutional memory, about the importance of records management as a political tool. They are not wrong. All of those readings are accurate. But I think the deepest thing in it is something simpler. It is this. Mari's Kale, at 29, working alone in a mission office with observer status and no particular reason to believe she would be remembered, did the work correctly. She did not do it correctly because she expected vindication. She did it correctly because the work was worth doing correctly, because a document that mattered deserved to exist in more places than any single institution could control. She was right, it did matter. 60 years later, in a chamber designed to make everything look like it had already been decided, it mattered in a way that could not be revised or corrected or quietly withdrawn. The throne's chief archivist submitted a formal request to transfer to a different posting 4 months after the session. The request was approved. I heard, through channels, that she had taken a position in an academic institution's archive management division, which is about as far from compact political ratification work as it is possible to get while remaining in the same professional category. I do not know whether she made that choice out of embarrassment, or principle, or simple prudence. All three would be defensible. I know only that the Concord of Verath's preamble still reads as it was written 60 years ago, and that its founding attribution still names 3 species, and that one of them is ours. The chamber that morning had been quiet in the way of a room that thought it had already decided. It learned, in the space of 1 data chip and 11 minutes, that it had not, that the decision it thought it was making had already been answered, quietly, completely, 60 years before anyone in that room was born. That is the thing about a record that exists in 43 places. It does not need you to defend it. It does not need anyone in the room to stand up and speak. It only needs to exist, and to have been there long enough, and to have been placed in enough hands by someone who understood, without drama or announcement, that the work is the answer. We didn't speak in that chamber. We had already spoken, 60 years before. We had been careful enough to make sure the speaking would last. That is the part I think about when I think about Kale. Not the foresight, not the politics, the care. The simple, professional, unglamorous care of doing the work so that it would still be there when it was needed, regardless of whether anyone was left to remember why it had been done. The Compact's full membership registry now lists 11 species. Our entry reads, Founding co-proposing and co-drafting member, Concord of Verath ratification cohort, year 0 of the Compact calendar. Not auxiliary technical support. Founding member. The record says what it always said, what it will always say in 43 archives, across the 11 species compact and beyond. They had no protocol for that. They had never needed one, because in 400 years of compact administration, no one had built a document that careful and distributed it that widely, and then waited that long. They do now. And if they do not, if there is a body, somewhere in the next century, that imagines it has found a way to correct a record that was distributed carefully enough, broadly enough, into archives that are independent enough, then I hope there is someone who prepared for that too. In the same way. Quietly, completely, years before anyone thought to look. That is the only kind of preparation that works. The kind that is already complete when the session is called to order.